Hey Rebels, if I were to ask you a question about what makes a city great, what makes a city livable, what would you say? Do your thoughts drift to good schools and walkable neighborhoods? Or maybe it's abundant green space and parks? How about entertainment options like live music, movie theaters, sports, restaurants? What about great restaurants that provide a culinary experience that you'd tell your friends about, that you'd take pictures of your plate for? What does all this have to do with craft beer, right? This is just a podcast about beer. Well, that's a great question. And my answer to that is another question. What is the economic and social impact of a craft brewery in a neighborhood or a community? Today's guest is Professor Vanessa Mathews with the University of Regina. Much of her work in the past has focused on craft beer. She's given lectures on her research and her findings about the craft beer industry, and she's currently working on a project about craft breweries and building reuse in Ontario. I want to pick her brain about her research and find out what questions she's asking and what she hopes to learn from her work. Vanessa, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
How's it going?
It's going good.
Yay, Friday.
Yay, happy International Beer Day.
Today, to celebrate International Beer Day, we've got something special. You're never going to be able to get it again, probably. It's the Frut Brut IPA by Rebellion.
Sounds fantastic.
Cheers.
Cheers.
So it's like pink and rhubarby looking.
It is a gorgeous color.
Can I tell you a secret about the color? It's not from the rhubarb. It's from hibiscus tea.
Amazing.
Yeah. Vanessa snuck into the room in the back where the tea is, and she goes, "They'll never know." She's like, "They'll just assume it's from the rhubarb." It's hibiscus.
Amazing.
But she felt that that nice pink color would help give you that visual cue. And I think it's kind of pretty.
It's very tasty. It's got a range of complex flavors in it, and it's nice.
What are you picking out?
I don't know. There's a little bit of bitterness, but also kind of a nice soury type taste. And I don't know, it's just a complex number of flavors that are kind of sitting on my tongue in a nice kind of way.
I feel like I'm getting a little bit of berry tartness, but it's kind of dry. Has that dry kind of, you know, when you're drinking a red wine.
Oh yes,
finish?
yeah.
Yeah, maybe that's coming from the rhubarb.
Maybe.
Rhubarb kind of does that to your mouth.
It does, yeah. It smells awesome too. It smells a lot fruitier.
Your nose is probably better than mine. I'm a little bit stuffed up. What aromas are you picking out?
I mean, I can smell the rhubarb a little bit. And maybe some haskap. It just has a nice berry kind of smell.
A berry smell? I'm not getting anything, but I have a dead nose today. Sorry.
Sorry for you.
One of the fun things about haskaps is we grew them in the bushes at the brewery, and the rhubarb is actually planted behind the brewery. It's growing like weeds. So Vanessa scooped it all up and said, let's make something fun and different and weird. Dave said this was his most looked forward to beer for the IPA day, which just happened yesterday. Yes,
that's amazing. And it's a hyper-local beer, right? You don't have to go very far to get your ingredients. And
one of the other cool facts about haskap is it's native to Saskatchewan. It was growing up north, just wild. And one of the people he's a scientist, he's a botanist or whatever, he gathered up a bunch of the haskaps and brought them back down to Saskatoon to grow them at the university.
Amazing.
And it just spread from there.
Yeah.
And then a brewery, I believe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but Nokomis, which we both love, did a haskap sour.
They did.
And people need to check out this haskap sour.
Yeah, that's also a really awesome color too. When you pour it into your glass, it's nice with the sours. I always want to know what they look like, right?
With Jeff and Aaron and his crew at Nokomis, they're always doing something really cool. And I like to see that other Saskatchewan breweries are picking up the haskap kind of vibe too.
Yes, yeah, it's nice.
Would you give this beer a thumbs up?
I would.
Share it with your friends?
2 thumbs up, yeah.
2 thumbs up? Oh, nice. I don't know if anyone listening will ever get a chance to taste this. I think it might be sold out by the time, but...
Sorry, it was wonderful. Right?
We'll enjoy it today.
And live vicariously through us.
Yeah, nana boo boo. What did Dave say? He said, estate-grown rhubarb and haskap, tart, fruity, hoppy, delicious. But I don't find it to be very overly hoppy.
It's a bit sharp, a little bit. I mean, I can see the hops in there.
I think your palate's probably better than mine. I'm just a dead nose today, so no good. So what's your background academically?
Yeah, I'm a geographer by training. I'm an urban geographer. I have an interest in urban planning and an interest now in craft beer.
How did you get into craft beer?
I was studying the Gooderham and Worts distillery in Toronto, and they were transforming into the distillery district, and they brought on Mill Street early on, which was a craft brewer at the time. And they were one of the early tenants, and then a lot of other interests just started building and developing from that. And so there seemed to be a connection between the brewery and interest being drawn in this industrial transformation. And I had a colleague at Trent University who was looking at LeBreton Flats, and Mill Street ended up there. And so we both kind of got on the phone and said, we need to work on this and we need to write a paper and try to figure out what's going on in this role of craft breweries going into undervalorized lands and really transforming them. And then it's just really grown from that.
Talk to me like I'm 6. What does that mean?
What does that mean? So basically you have older buildings in that case that had sat vacant for a decade or more. They were being used by the film industry a lot, but there wasn't a lot of interest by the development community about coming in and transforming those spaces. We had a private sector party that wanted to kind of take on that risk, and they brought on Mill Street kind of knowing that people would want to come back to that space, right? They would go there, try the beer, and then that would become a destination spot. And then if people are going routinely back for beer, then they're probably going to check out other things in that space. So it kind of develops interest, it creates value in those buildings. And then other people kind of look at it and say, hey, if the brewery's doing it, maybe I can do it too, right, with a bakery or whatever else.
And how long has this study been going, or how long have you been working on this?
That was back in, 2004. I started that project. And co-wrote a paper with Roger Picton I think it came out in 2014. And so since that point, we've kind of expanded that research, and we started asking more questions, right? And we started asking about what are the effects of breweries in smaller urban places is what the research is at present.
What are we finding? What are we learning?
It's fascinating. It really is. So our research has taken us to Ontario, which is where it's based, and we're looking at smaller urban centers between 1,000 and 30,000 people and looking at the effects that they're having on those communities. And so it's amazing to see it because about, I'd say 78% of the breweries in Ontario that fit into that category of smaller urban places are going into buildings that already exist. So they're
hermit crabs.
And it's amazing to see these transformations. So you have schools that are being transformed into breweries. You have churches that are being transformed into breweries. You've got waterfront properties, you've got main streets, you've got farms, you've got buildings that have sat vacant for years and nothing else could really go into them. And then you have a craft brewery that goes in and is employing, 70 people in the community now. So there's all kinds of reverberations and effects that these breweries are having within their places.
I don't think it was your study, but stuff that we've read and looked at was saying when a craft brewery moves into a economically maybe less successful area or a place that's just needing a tenant, it's like a shot in the arm or steroids. It lifts up that area economically in a way that maybe other businesses do not. And it's uniquely economic booster.
It really is. I mean, one of the things that we've found is that you can study the impact of beer through tourism numbers, right? You can look at it through economic job creation. But then you've got all of these other economic benefits that we're seeing, right? The fact that it draws interest in those places means that you've got a lot of things that are hard to measure. So you might have more people moving into a community. You might have real estate values increasing as a result of the proximity of certain buildings to that brewery. You've got spin-off effects in terms of their support for local things. So craft breweries are really good at supporting their local, and they will get the graphic designer in town to make their designs, and they will buy honey from the honey producer that's close by, and they will source their ingredients locally wherever possible, and they'll also turn to collaborative partners. They might join forces and make a soap, or join forces and make some other kind of product. So they're constantly engaging in these kinds of effects, which are more difficult to measure perhaps, but also equally important to the economic health of that community.
So it's not just Rebellion. Like, I kind of live in a bubble, but our honey comes from Tisdale, and our lentils are grown in Saskatchewan. We have local tattoo artists doing all our can designs. I know it's not just us, but you're seeing that everywhere?
We're seeing a lot of it. So, I mean, I think that it's not as though every craft brewery is going to go hardcore into, local support, and it just depends on, I guess, the philosophy and the brand, right, in terms of what people are trying to create. But we certainly do see that kind of support where, I mean, if you take a craft brewery and you think about the economic impact of that, and you compare it to an international, multinational conglomerate of beer making, like, that money isn't staying in the local economy in the same kind of way that it is when you have a craft beer maker that's actually supporting all of those local things.
I'm not an academic, but we've long pushed the idea that if you support a local craft brewery, that money, when you buy that beer, stays. It helps pay our taxes, it employs more local people, it helps our schools and stuff. But that's kind of like pat on the back, self-serving. How does that work from, like, your perspective? What's going on?
Yeah, I think it's a more sustainable kind of setup of an economy, right? It's making sure that you are kind of employing local people, and you're employing local people that are creating products for you, and all of that is really, as you say, it's reinvesting back into community. Craft breweries also are very good at sponsoring events and giving to charities and doing all that kind of outreach, which I think is also equally important in terms of community development, right?
How can I take your research or studies and then, like, whack people on the head with it? Where can I find this information?
Well, we're still in the process of writing up the smaller urban centers, and I'm really excited to do that, in part because I think that what we hope to do is to show best practices for policymakers and for municipalities. So we have a lot of municipalities that kind of recognize the value of craft breweries and are very supportive and try through the planning process to make the whole process of transformation easier. And then you have some municipalities which are rather new to things, and they're worried about water, or they're worried about something else, but they're not creating tangible strategies for how to ensure that the brewery can go into that space. So we saw a lot of examples where there's just a lot of delays.
Who's doing it right?
Yeah, I think that larger municipalities, for the most part, are a little bit more open to breweries going into different types of spaces, but they're not doing it all right. So one of the things that we find is that because breweries are really trendy and people are really excited about them, they can spur a different process of upgrading. And so what we want to try to avoid is a process called gentrification. And gentrification is really about a higher income group going into a space, whether it's residential or commercial, and driving out the people that are there currently, and especially the most vulnerable populations, right? So what we see in gentrification is you have, let's say, a really large metropolitan area where you've got a number of breweries going into a lower income neighborhood, and that creates interest and value in that neighborhood, and then the rents all go up, and then we've got people being driven out. So we can't really blame the brewery, right? The brewery can do a couple of things to try to mitigate that. I mean, they can hire locally, they can have different price points, they can remember that other people were there before them, right? And try to give back to the community in whatever way they can. But we also need to see structural changes as well. So we might need to have demolition controls go into that area so that people can't just demolish buildings. The province might need to set up rent controls so that people aren't forced out. There's community land trusts that can be set up as well.
What's a land trust?
Yeah, a community land trust is basically a nonprofit organization that takes land from outside of the private market and it kind of secures it for community good. So it basically makes sure that the land will stay affordable. So because they own it, they lease it out to residents or commercial partners who will pay a set amount of money. If that land sells, like if they decide to sell it, then some of the money would go to the person that's been leasing it, but the rest goes back into the community land trust. So we have hundreds of these in the US, and it's a really good way of ensuring affordability within a particular place where land might be a really hot commodity and there might be a lot of competitions for space.
I'm sorry, I need to wrap my head around that. Why, you have runaway land prices, so then nobody can afford to buy, and then nobody can afford to live?
Yeah, I mean, it's basically that, I mean, we've seen it a little bit in Regina. So we had a point around 2006 where we had house values go up by 150% here.
Yeah.
And similar to rents, right? And so that made it really unaffordable for the most vulnerable members of society. And so what it does is it protects a piece of land and it makes sure that, that the people that are living there are going to pay the same amount, and it keeps it out of that potential for the hyperinflation to take place.
And hyperinflation is a bad thing. I know a little bit about economics, studied a bit, but what I remember, maybe you can disabuse me of a notion or expound upon it, but my understanding is rent control ultimately is a negative. That if rent controls are in place, the properties are neglected, and then people suffer in the long term because the landlords don't have an incentive to keep it up. Is that propaganda, or how do we manage that?
Yeah, maybe a little bit. I mean, I feel like what rent controls do is that they create a scenario where people aren't going to have their rents go up by 150%. And then if you have landlords that aren't actually taking care of the property, then that's a bylaw issue to me, right? Then you bring in inspections and you make sure that people are keeping up their property for public safety. So, I think that it works for the most part to have rent control in areas. The other thing that works is to build more affordable housing, right? And so if you know that a brewery might kind of contribute to these types of land escalations, then maybe you support affordable housing nearby to ensure that you're not driving out those residents who might not be able to afford those changes. I mean, the problem is you can kind of rearrange the geography of poverty so much, but people have to go somewhere. And if they run out of places, they end up on the streets or they end up in emergency housing situations.
When we create the social situation that, say, gentrification, if we consider it to be a negative thing and people are displaced, what is the consequence? Poverty, crime, addiction,
Absolutely.
Interactions with police, dependency on hospitals or social workers?
Absolutely.
What does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, it means that...
I'm just guessing.
Yeah, no, but that's exactly what it is, right? You have all those dependencies and you have people who are actually engaged in petty crime so that they have somewhere to live, because then they'll go to prison and they'll get to spend the winters there. So it creates this scenario which we really don't ever want to see. And I think what we need to think about is community development, right? It's like investment's not bad. Investment's great. We just want to make sure that investment is happening from the bottom up, and it makes sure that the entire community is raised up through that, right? So craft breweries, I think, have a really interesting role to play in kind of revaluing those lands and drawing interest and drawing that change in identity for a lot of places. And we just need to make sure from the municipal standpoint that we're protecting the most vulnerable when that's happening.
Is that what they mean when they say sustainability?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's part of it. We can talk about sustainability in a number of different ways, but to me, that's like social sustainability, right? And I'm also interested in the environmental sustainability that craft beer really brings. So I talked about how breweries are often going into existing buildings. And the really interesting thing about that is that we live in a society where I think oftentimes people think that things that are old are bad, right? And the reality is that when we demolish something prematurely, we lose all of this energy that's contained within it. So people talk about this term embodied energy.
I've never heard of that. What does it mean?
So it means it basically takes up the amount of energy that's required to source, fabricate, and build a structure. So when we tear it down before it's lived its life cycle, then basically we lose all that. And then we have to make it all again to put in a new structure, right? So it's better to keep the old structure as much as possible. Environmentally, it's more sustainable. I was reading an article in the US that talked about how the housing crisis there in part was caused by people prematurely knocking down older housing, because older things end up being cheaper often, right? So this is part of why I think that breweries go into existing buildings, is that you've got cheaper costs. Oftentimes you've got location, which is really going for you. So oftentimes you've got water and sewer hookup already. You've got more walkability because of where you're likely to find existing buildings. And you've got maybe a more treed landscape as well. So you've got all those benefits that traditional urban design has created already for us.
If you're building on the edge or the outskirts of the city, maybe it's designed more for vehicles and driving. But internally, 100 years ago, it was more designed for walking because cars weren't as prevalent. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
I don't know.
Yes, which is why it would be good to have more residential in the downtown, right? It's, you have more residential and then you have more walkability. So it promotes that idea of not having to have the car all the time.
One of the things we've been advocating for or fighting on behalf of is developing the rail yard renewal initiative. When we picked our location, we were told some high-rise condos, mixed income places are going to be going up, and we said, great, that's a consumer base that will come visit us. They're going to be our neighbors. They're going to be our little baked-in rebels that can just walk to the brewery. And then it kind of got put on pause, and we're like, crap.
Yeah, and it's a project that really needs to happen, I think. Like, it's a really important project that needs to happen. I can't think of another city in Canada that has such prime real estate in the core of a city that's just lying there vacant. And there's so many possibilities of what can happen with that land. And I mean, I think the most important thing is the bridge that connects the downtown to the warehouse district.
Oh, we want it so bad.
Yeah, and it makes sense. There's 500 people living in the warehouse district, and they need to be able to have different options for transportation, right? If you don't have a good bike lane set up, then people aren't going to bike. If you don't have good sidewalks set up, people aren't going to walk. It just is. You can look at it through a design point of view, right? You need to create the opportunities and the infrastructure for people to make those decisions.
What's the best way forward? What should we do first?
In terms of developing the rail yards?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should get the bridge done for sure. I mean, I think that was the intention. I don't know what happened. I heard that there was money that was supposed to support the renewal of Dudney and kind of start that bridge. And then I think everything else will just follow. And I think it will be a really amazing community when it gets constructed. And we need to do the other site, the old stadium site. I was reading an article about how there's a proposal that it gets turned into a parking lot. And I just feel like that will be the saddest outcome, even if it's just a temporary one, for it to become a parking lot. Like, we can do so many amazing things in this city to make it really livable and to enhance everybody's experiences.
Correct me if I'm wrong. When I read it, my understanding was a temporary parking lot would then start generating revenue to remediate the land and prepare it for development. Isn't that a good thing, or?
Parking lots are never a good thing.
Why is that?
Well, I think that they promote a particular type of like movement, right? It basically allows us to keep driving, and environmentally that's not a good thing. I would say I would go knocking door to door in that community, and I would say, what do you need? What do you want here that's temporary that we can put here for 5 years? Like, let's make something that actually shows the value of that land, that makes people value it, right? A parking lot is not going to do that at all. I mean, a parking lot is never temporary here. I don't know any parking lots that have been temporary, and it scares me that that's just going to be a revenue generating thing that never gets turned into the low income housing that it's promising.
What have big cities done?
What have big cities done to...
Or what have other successful cities done with, say, potential land that could have been turned into a parking lot?
They've built other things. They've built residential, so you have more of a community that lives in the downtown. I mean, you have a lot of examples of rail yards being transformed into condo buildings and communities, and whether that's, helpful for all classes is another kind of question, but I think at least it's creating a space that people can live in that has a function.
We've been told it's like a 10 to 15-year timeline, but we would like to see movement now. How do we get these guys, how do we light a fire under them?
Yeah, I think the hard thing that is happening right now is I think that the land valuation went down a little bit, and so that kind of stalled a lot of investments. And then we overbuilt in the city, right? We overbuilt out rather than in. And so I would just put let's stop building out until we get the core kind of planned out and done. Like, let's stop kind of creating this push-pull kind of scenario, right? Where we keep spreading outward and we haven't developed what we're supposed to. We have a great goal of intensification, but we have not been meeting that goal at all, right? So we need to make sure that we are actually meeting that goal before anything else gets built.
Correct me if I'm wrong, because I may be wrong. I may have bad information, but I was talking to a developer, and what they were saying was it's easier to build out with our current rules and bylaws and system. It's easier and cheaper for them to build out and build new parks and new roads and all that junk instead of doing infill development, because it's so unpredictable. They can spend tens of thousands up to millions of dollars just submitting a plan for a piece of land to develop, and then they feel capriciously or arbitrarily the city does not give them the feedback they need, or just cancels the project, or gives them so many brick walls or hoops or red tape to cut through that they're just like, the hell with you. I'm not going to develop downtown or build up because you've made it too hard for me.
I think it's a bit of a combination. I think that it would be a really sad state if we were making decisions about what kind of city we wanted to live in based on economics alone. So that's the first thing I'd say, right? It is cheaper to build outward, but it's not a sustainable city, and it's not a city that I really want to live in if it keeps expanding outward. The other part of it, though, is let's make it easier for people to build in the downtowns, right? Like, if the problem is the sewer lines and the water, and that's become the unpredictability in it, let's fix that stuff in a certain area. Let's make it really attractive for developers to come in and to make those changes, because we want to see that as a city, right? Because we want to support it. And so that's just a change to me in terms of maybe we change the tax system. Maybe we create that infrastructure right away and we parcel out particular strips that we're going to focus on, right? Broad Street would be a great place to start. There's lots of places that I think really need that injection of new builds and transformations of existing buildings.
You're blowing my mind. I thought we were going to talk about craft beer today.
Me too. I've got both hats on today, I guess. Like, I'm an urban geographer, urban planner, and yeah.
So where do we go from here? I feel like we've crisscrossed all these intersecting questions of like craft beer and geography. And is that just where you live?
That's where I live. And I think the way to maybe get back to there for me is to think about something that we haven't really talked about, which is community, right? And I think ultimately what we're trying to do is to grow a community. And I know that that's a big part of what Rebellion is trying to do too, right? And we want to grow a community that's sustainable, that we support each other, that we kind of grow together. And so one of the interesting things that we're finding when we're looking at breweries is that they are creating these new social hubs. And this has been kind of unexpected in some ways, right? It's, you are going into these spaces and you're not just having a whole bunch of beer and then kind of walking home like that, or hopefully walking home like that. Instead, you've got these spaces that are being developed where you go into them and you create community and you're talking to people about what's happening, and you're playing board games and you're playing all of these things and you're eating food at the truck outside, and there's just this collaborative kind of community feel. in these spaces, which I think is really important. I was teaching a class. I was given the opportunity to teach a course from January to April called The Place of Craft Beer. And I kept, tapping myself in the head and saying, is this really happening? This is amazing. And I had these 16 students that came from a range of different backgrounds, and we got to talk about, all of the different issues and what's happening within breweries and how they're affecting place. And so that was really the way that things were coming together.
Can I take that class?
You can, if you want. I mean, I'm on sabbatical this year, but I'm hoping that when I go back that I get to teach it again, because it was really special for me to be talking about cities and sustainability and gender. And you've got someone from classics, some couple of people from education, someone from business, and we're all coming at this from a different kind of perspective, but different lens, but in a way that's really amazing, right? And it helps us to all grow as thinkers, I think.
Does craft beer make it easier to explain these complex problems? Does it make it a little more digestible instead of abstract up in your head?
Yeah, maybe. I think it's an interesting lens, right? To think about urban planning, or to think about gender, or to think about sustainability. I mean, it's just a different way of kind of approaching things. And one of the things that we were looking at is kind of how beer started and the types of spaces that it was created in or consumed within. And I think what we're seeing today is almost a return to the tavern, right? In these taverns, you had everybody there drinking, and people would be buying each other drinks, and it was just like happy, kind of messy place in a sense. And kids were drinking beer, and you'd have these table beers that had really low alcohols, but or alcohol content. But I was thinking about it, and I was thinking, we've got all these craft breweries now, which are family-friendly spaces. They're open to dogs, right? They're open to people staying and playing board games and talking to each other. So in many ways, we've kind of come full circle, and we've returned to that historical consumption.
You're making me feel really good about everything we're doing at Rebellion right now.
Good.
It's like, you're flattering me. I'm blushing. My ears are burning. But we are trying to do those things. You can bring kids now, and dogs. We have Dungeons and Dragons, every few months. And when I pitched the idea to Mark, he's like, I don't know. I guess you could try it once. And then we packed the full tap room, and sales were crazy. And I'm like, D&D guys, they're my homies. They love snacks and they love craft beer.
Right.
They've got good taste. And he's like, I guess you could do it again. And then it kept getting bigger and bigger. And now we're having to turn people away because it's so busy.
Yeah. And that's the community part, though, right? I mean, I was traveling to places this past summer. I was doing some of the research on the smaller urban centers in Ontario. And I heard from one brewery that said, the people that are living here had nowhere to go. So now we just hold events, and they all come to the brewery and they just hang out because they didn't have any spaces to kind of talk to each other and to see each other. So I think that that's a value that is taking place in breweries that we can't kind of overlook.
You're doing this project now. When do you expect to kind of wrap it up?
Well, we just actually got funding from a large federal agency, which is SHRC, for a 2-year project. So hopefully by 2021, and I'm hoping that sooner than that point, we'll start getting some of this research out so that we can kind of share what we've found and do some conferences and that kind of thing. But that project itself should be wrapped up by that point.
So you think maybe in a year from now, you can come mid-project and pepper me again with a bunch of interesting, give me a sneak preview?
Yeah, that sounds cool.
Well, I want to thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
It was great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
Totally unexpected. All these ideas. Rebels, thanks for tuning in today. If you want to find the latest news about Rebellion Brewing, be sure to check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Untapped. As you know, we're part of the Saskatchewan Podcast Network. You can find us at the saskpodcastnetwork.com. There's a whole bunch of great stories being told by local people, produced by local people. I'm going to include links to Vanessa's work so you can find out more about what her team's doing when it comes to studying craft beer. Maybe you want to jump into it and just find out more information about this really cool stuff. I've got a million more questions to ask her, and I know I can't wait to have her back on the show again. Thank you for joining the Rebellion.